There is not a misprint in the bulletin. Our Old Testament lesson is from Job, from chapter 38, verse 9, through chapter 40, verse 4. It begins on page 485 in the Old Testament. The book of Job divides into three sections: the prologue, the first two chapters, the dialogue, chapters 3 through 37, and the monologue, chapters 38 through 42, where God shows up and asks Job 77 questions that Job simply cannot answer. In today's passage, God asks, "Can you care for my creation?" Listen for God's words to you in this lengthy passage. Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their covert?
Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food?
Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth? When they crouch to give birth to their offspring and are delivered of their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go forth and do not return to them.
Who has let the wild ass go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift ass, to which I have given the steppe for its home, the salt land for its dwelling place? It scorns the tumult of the city. It does not hear the shouts of the driver. It ranges the mountains as its pasture and searches after every green thing.
Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will it spend the night at your crib? Can you tie it in the furrow with ropes? And will it harrow the valleys after you? Will you depend on it because its strength is great? And will you hand over your labor to it? Do you have faith in it that it will return and bring your grain to your threshing floor?
The ostrich's wings flap wildly, though its pinions lack plumage. For it leaves its eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them and that a wild animal may trample them. It deals cruelly with its young as if they were not its own. Though its labor should be in vain, yet it has no fear, because God has made it forget wisdom and given it no share in understanding. When it spreads its plumes aloft, it laughs at the horse and its rider.
Do you give the horse its might? Do you clothe its neck with mane? Do you make it leap like the locust? Its majestic snorting is terrible. It paws violently, exults mightily. It goes out to meet the weapons. It laughs at fear and is not dismayed. It does not return back from the sword, but upon it rattle the quiver, the flashing spear, and the javelin. With fierceness and rage it swallows the ground. It cannot stand still at the sound of a trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, it says, "Aha!" From a distance, it smells the battle, the thunder of the captains and the shouting.
Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars and spreads its wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes its nest on high? It lives on the rock and makes its home in the fastness of the rocky crag. From there it spies its prey. It sees it from far away. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is.
And the Lord said to Job, "Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Anyone who argues with God must respond."
Then Job answered the Lord, "See, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand upon my mouth."
The word of the Lord.
The The pictures on the front of your bulletin this morning are pictures that I took when I traveled with 5 other members from our congregation to Voi, Kenya last October. That trip was so transformative for my life, getting to meet the people there and call them my friends. The landscape and the animals that we got to see while we were there were an added bonus. But upon returning, I find them equally as transformative. Before we went to Kenya, I didn't even think about seeing ostriches in the wild. I guess, it's just not one of those things that you think of. But we came upon these in a turn in the road, and they have, I don't know if you can see all their little babies down beneath them. And it really was something to behold, to see at that moment. Ostriches have got to be one of the world's strangest creatures. For instance, did you know that they can grow to be over 9 feet tall and weigh more than 350 pounds? They have the largest eye of any land animal that there is, and their eye is actually larger than their brain, which would hardly fit into a teaspoon. And despite having these really large eyes, they still tend to run into many obstacles and get wounded that way. Ostriches don't have teeth, so they eat small stones and carry them in their crop to help them grind up their food. And adult ostriches have been known to carry over 2 pounds of small pebbles in their crops. They often live in communities, and they share a communal nest. And hens can lay up to 60 eggs per year. I think they're just fascinating. And the author of Job must have thought they were fascinating as well, because in the book of Job, as we read this morning in chapter 39, 6 full verses spoken by the divine are devoted to the ostrich. 6 full verses of God's own speech are devoted to the ostrich. Now, today's reading is the middle part of the longest divine speech in the entire Bible. God's speech actually goes on for 125 verses. We read less than half, so we're lucky. I know Job is a strange book, but why in the world, when God chooses to speak to us, would God choose an ostrich as the topic? So in order to understand this, I'm going to backpedal a little bit this morning and make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to Job. It's a really interesting book. If you haven't ever read the whole thing, I encourage you to do so. But you might remember that it is really the book of the Bible that seeks to answer, why do bad things happen to good people? It doesn't always do so satisfactorily. I'm just being honest there, but that is what this book is about. And in it, Job is a prominent man in his society, upright in every sense of the word, benevolent. He is an established leader, a model patriarch. He's known for his justice. He's father of 7 sons and 7 daughters. He enjoys good health and plentiful living. According to the wisdom tradition that Job espoused, those blessings, those material blessings in his life were a sign of his righteousness. That is until the accuser enters the scene. In Hebrew, the accuser is known as Ha-Satan. And this is the forerunner of our later concept of Satan. But here, Ha-Satan is simply the accuser, a character who is a member in full standing of God's own heavenly council, a kind of prosecuting attorney who wanders the face of the earth looking for iniquities. Now, we often think that Ha-Satan engages God in dialogue, but that's not true. God engages Ha-Satan in dialogue in the book of Job, and in the ensuing conversation, almost kind of dangles Job in the accuser's face, saying, "Find fault with this one." Now, the accuser accuses God of being overprotective of Job and challenges God to remove the protection so Job can actually feel what suffering feels like. Then the accuser says Job will be like most other humans and surely curse God. Now God takes that bet with the accuser, and suddenly I feel like we're in a song, but a personal hell is then unleashed upon Job's life. The only thing that is spared at God's request is Job's life itself. Everything else is lost. The first 36 chapters of Job detail how Job loses everything and everyone he once loved. His friends then come to try and help him figure out what's going on, where he went wrong, because they are, like him, children of the wisdom tradition, and they all assume that his losses are the result of divine discipline or retribution from sin. Unlike his friends, though, Job maintains his innocence. He says, "I haven't done anything to deserve this." And while Job does refrain from cursing God, he instead curses the day on which he was born. At the end of these 36 chapters, Job's losses have exposed the cracks and his limits of his model of God. Job insists that he is indeed a good and decent and fair man, and thinking that God must be like him, he demands that God treat him likewise. So in chapter 30, he comes out with it and accuses God, saying, "You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me." And you can't really blame him, because he has lost it all. Family, health, wealth. He has also lost everything he once believed in. The tradition of wisdom that he espoused and adhered to all of his life has crumbled beneath the weight of his own bad experiences. The social system that he once ruled has now cast him out. And the generosity that he once gave to the poor is now suspect as being nothing more than a patronizing act. His very idea of God is dying right before his eyes, and he cries out to God. Now, in his book, The Stars Beneath Us, theologian Paul Wallace writes, Job has nowhere to turn. He is losing his God, and it's a hard moment when your best idea of God collapses, because for that same moment, it looks for all the world like it is God that is collapsing. And so God finally speaks to Job. Out of a whirlwind comes God's voice. And the whirlwind itself is significant, because if you've ever seen one, you know there's nothing tangible about it. No shape, no reason. Only a swirl of leaves and dust to show its existence. And God says from the whirlwind, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you will declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding." Wow. I imagine if I were Job at this point, I would like to just take all those words and shove them back in my mouth. My dad used to say, if you ask a question, you better make sure you're ready to hear the answer. And God's voice comes through loud and clear. God's realm of understanding, interest, and activity in the world far exceeds that of Job or any other human. In what follows, God does not once engage any of Job's many complaints, theological questions, or cries for justice. Wallace points out that in these 125 verses of God's longest speech, there is not one word about worship, about sin, about guilt or sacrifice. There is also no mention of the law or the prophets. There is silence about forgiveness, repentance, atonement, and even love. Maybe even more peculiar is that God says nothing regarding the ideal sought by Job himself, justice. There is silence regarding all of our preconceived theological categories of thought. Silence. Now, maybe it's not because God doesn't have anything to say about them. It's just that here, apparently, God has more important things to say, to tell us. Mysterious things, foundational things, things about the earth and the wind, the rain and the stars, things about ostriches and feral donkeys, lions, ravens, mountain goats, and a topic for another day that we didn't quite get to in our reading, the monsters of the land and the sea. So rather than answer Job's questions of justice or Job's friends' questions of theology, God makes a decisive move instead toward the wild things. Not only is God's speech about the wild things, but God speaks of them with a language of intimacy. God talks about witnessing the births of the mountain goats, seeing the calving of the deer. God talks about being there as young animals grow strong and search for food and eventually leave their parents' side to wander into the world on their own. God doesn't just talk about moments and picturesque landscapes with wildlife in the background somewhere, like my picture. God talks about knowing this landscape, knowing these creatures intimately. The poetry is beautiful, and it's clear that God cherishes moments with the wild things. God cares about and for the land and the animals, these wild things that have nothing to do with humankind, these creatures who roam the land where humans do not dare to live, these untamed beings that love their freedom and mock our efforts to domesticate them, these silly animals like the ostrich that we do not understand or have any use for in our world. God sees them. God knows them. God cherishes them. And where does that leave Job? He's hushed. Having been silent now for 73 verses, he struggles to find words, replying to God of the whirlwind, saying, "See, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand upon my mouth." Job is humbled by his divine tour of the wild places, having once, not long ago, thought of himself as the very center of God's whole world. Job now begins to understand the difficulties and the ways in which he accounted for his worth. God loves even the most marginal creatures, the ones living on the edge of civilization, even the crazy ones that don't seem to make much sense to us at all. God is present to them. Job's foundations have been shattered. The tradition that has guided him thus far in his life has suffered major blows in light of the havoc that has been unleashed in his life. Wallace writes that Job's tour of the wild places has restored order for Job in a way he never imagined possible, when he suddenly realizes that from God's point of view, it might just be Job and not these animals that occupy the outskirts of creation. That the center, as Job has imagined it, may indeed be the periphery, and that what is marginal to Job is not marginal to God at all. And just like that, Job begins to understand the world anew, with an eye toward the wild things. Amen.